The morning air carried the distinct crispness that only September in the western mountains could deliver. Dew clung to alpine grasses, catching the first golden rays of sunlight and transforming the sloping meadow into a sea of glittering diamonds. Towering pines stood sentinel along the ridgelines, their dark silhouettes cutting sharply against a cloudless sky that promised perfect conditions for those who understood the mountain's temperament. The hiker moved with practiced efficiency, methodically checking his equipment before setting out. At 47, with 19 years of serious backcountry experience, he had developed rituals that bordered on superstition. The topographic maps, though loaded in his GPS device, were also secured in waterproof casing in his pack. Technology failed. Experience didn't. He'd learned that lesson on a northwest face during an unexpected electrical storm 12 years prior, a memory that still visited him in dreams. His weathered hands moved with precision, adjusting the straps of his pack until the weight distributed evenly across his shoulders. The morning routine brought a familiar comfort, a meditation and movement that had carried him through the darkest period of his life after the accident. The mountains had been his salvation then, a place where grief couldn't follow him beyond the tree line, where the thin air and physical exertion left no room for anything but the present moment. "This is the day," he murmured to himself, a habit formed during solitary expeditions. His teenage children teased him about talking to himself when in the wilderness, but they understood. They'd witnessed how these solo hikes had gradually rebuilt him after their mother's illness, how the mountains had given him purpose when everything else seemed hollow. The trail he'd selected was rarely traveled, even by seasoned hikers. It cut through a remote section of wilderness in a less frequented area of the national forest, offering the solitude he craved. The Forest Service maintained minimal trails here, and that suited him perfectly. The hiker preferred paths less traveled, where nature remained relatively undisturbed by human traffic. As he began his ascent, the familiar weight of the pack against his back brought comfort. The rhythm of his breathing synchronized with his footsteps, creating a moving meditation that allowed his thoughts to settle. The sun climbed higher, filtering through the canopy in dappled patterns that shifted with the gentle mountain breeze. 3 miles in, he noticed the first discordant note in the symphony of the wilderness. The birds had gone quiet in a section where normally chickadees and nuthatches would be calling. He paused, water bottle halfway to his lips, and listened. The silence held an unnatural quality that raised the fine hairs on the back of his neck. In nearly 2 decades of mountain exploration, he'd learned to recognize the language of the forest, and right now, something was off. The hiker adjusted his route slightly, curiosity pulling him toward a ridgeline not on his original itinerary. Experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about that unnatural pocket of silence demanded investigation. The deviation would add perhaps an hour to his journey, but daylight was abundant, and his supply pack was well stocked for contingencies. As he climbed higher, the forest thinned, giving way to rocky outcroppings that required more technical skill to navigate. The silence persisted, spreading like an invisible fog across the mountainside. Even the wind seemed to respect whatever boundary he was crossing, dying down to an occasional whisper through stunted pines that clung tenaciously to the increasingly rocky terrain. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, unusually low, its piercing cry the only sound that dared break the unnatural quiet. The hiker watched its flight path, noting how the bird seemed reluctant to cross a particular section of the ridge ahead. Wildlife behavior often signaled what human senses couldn't detect. Another lesson from years on the trail. The air felt different too, charged somehow, like the moments before a summer thunderstorm, though the sky remained clear. He checked his altimeter, 8,940 feet. Not particularly high for these mountains, but high enough that the vegetation had shifted to hardier alpine varieties. Scattered wildflowers, defiant against the approaching autumn, added splashes of purple and yellow among the rocks. The silence deepened as he approached the mysterious ridgeline. No scampering of ground squirrels, no buzzing insects, just the sound of his boots on stone and his measured breathing. A sense of anticipation built in his chest, though he couldn't articulate why. After so many years exploring these mountains, he'd thought them incapable of surprising him anymore. He would soon discover how wrong he was. The first indication that something was truly amiss came when the hiker spotted unusual scarring on a cluster of pines near the ridgeline. The trees bore marks inconsistent with lightning strikes or natural weathering, jagged gashes that cut through bark at uniform heights. some with embedded fragments that glinted unnaturally in the midday sun. His pace slowed, caution replacing curiosity. The terrain ahead opened into a small plateau before dropping sharply on the far side. The silence here was absolute, creating an acoustic vacuum that made even his careful footsteps sound thunderous. The hiker removed his pack, setting it against a boulder as he extracted his binoculars. Through the lenses, he scanned the area methodically, sweeping from left to right as he'd been taught during a search and rescue certification course years ago. At first, the plateau appeared unremarkable, just another rocky outcropping in an endless series of geological features that defined the mountain range. Then, his sweep caught something that didn't belong, a glint of metal, too angular, too purposeful to be natural. The hiker lowered the binoculars, blinking to ensure his eyes weren't deceiving him. When he raised them again, focusing more precisely, his breath caught in his throat. Partially concealed by a rock slide and stunted vegetation was the unmistakable shape of aircraft wreckage, but not some small Cessna or recreational plane. The visible section suggested something much larger, more sophisticated, a jet, a large one. His heart hammered against his ribs as he secured the binoculars and began picking his way toward the site. Years of wilderness training told him to be methodical, to document everything, but an almost magnetic pull urged him forward with uncharacteristic haste. Each step revealed more of the aircraft, sections of fuselage with faded markings, a partially intact wing structure embedded in the scree slope. When he finally stood before it, the scale became apparent. This was no small private jet, but something substantial, military or commercial grade, though without clear identifiers visible from his position. The wreckage was extensive yet concentrated, suggesting the aircraft had come down at a steep angle rather than skidding across the mountainside. Most puzzling was the absence of obvious fire damage. In his limited knowledge of crash sites, gleaned mostly from documentaries and a brief stint volunteering with mountain rescue, fire was nearly always a factor. Yet the metal here showed no significant scorching, just the dull patina of exposure to elements. "How long have you been here?" he murmured, voice sounding foreign in the unnatural quiet. The hiker's pulse throbbed in his ears as he circled the perimeter, maintaining a respectful distance. Training and common sense dictated caution. Unstable wreckage could shift, sharp edges could cause injury, and if this was recent, there might be hazardous materials. But another part of his assessment raised alarms. There were no markers, no emergency services tape, no evidence of an official investigation. This didn't make sense. A crash of this magnitude would trigger an immediate and extensive response from aviation authorities, the military, local search and rescue, depending on the aircraft type. Yet everything about this site suggested it had remained undisturbed for some time. The hiker pulled out his phone, unsurprised to find no signal. He was well beyond carrier range, as expected. The GPS function still worked, however, and he carefully marked the coordinates, adding a notation in the device's memo feature. Next came his camera, a professional-grade DSLR he carried for nature photography, but would now serve a different purpose. He documented the perimeter methodically, capturing wide shots of the crash site and close-ups of identifying features. After 30 minutes of external documentation, a realization settled over him like the mountain chill that arrived with afternoon shadows. He would need to look inside. Every instinct cultivated through years of wilderness experience screamed caution, yet the absence of official presence compelled investigation. If this was recent, there might be... He couldn't complete the thought. The least damaged access point appeared to be a tear in the fuselage near what would have been the midsection of the aircraft. The metal had peeled back, creating an opening large enough for a person to enter with care. The hiker approached slowly, testing each foothold before committing his weight. At the threshold, he paused, extracting a high-powered flashlight from his pack. The beam cut through the gloom inside, revealing what remained of an interior that contradicted every assumption he'd formed thus far. This was no ordinary aircraft. The configuration inside bore little resemblance to commercial or even conventional military layouts. Instead of rows of seating or cargo restraints, the space contained workstations with equipment he couldn't identify, most partially crushed from impact, but still recognizable as something beyond standard aviation technology. And then his light caught something that stopped his breath entirely. Among the twisted metal and shattered equipment lay evidence that turned his blood to ice. Documentation, storage units, and devices bearing markings that would be impossible to misinterpret. This wasn't just any jet. This was something that, by all official accounts, shouldn't exist. Something carrying information that contradicted decades of public statements. The hiker backed away from the opening, heart pounding so violently he could feel his pulse in his fingertips. 19 years of mountain experience had prepared him for many contingencies, injuries, wildlife encounters, extreme weather, but nothing had prepared him for this. He needed to document everything before making contact with authorities. Something told him that once that call was made, this site might disappear as though it had never existed. The hiker returned to where he'd left his main pack, movements now charged with urgency. The sun had begun its westward descent, casting longer shadows across the plateau. He had perhaps 4 hours of good daylight remaining, sufficient time for preliminary documentation if he worked efficiently. From his pack, he retrieved additional equipment, a more substantial first aid kit that included nitrile gloves, a backup camera battery, a portable power bank, and a small notebook with waterproof pages. The gloves snapped against his wrists as he pulled them on, a sound jarringly loud in the persistent silence of the crash site. Protected now against both potential hazards and the possibility of contaminating evidence, he approached the aircraft with renewed purpose. The initial shock had settled into a focused determination that narrowed his world to the immediate task: document everything, create an unassailable record. His second entry through the torn fuselage was more methodical. The beam of his flashlight swept systematically across the interior, while his camera captured images in a predetermined pattern. Wide-angle establishing shots followed by detailed close-ups, overlapping to ensure nothing was missed. The first significant evidence appeared innocuous: a clipboard with partially charred papers still attached. Unlike much of the high-tech equipment surrounding it, this was disarmingly ordinary. The pages contained charts and data tables, some rows marked with highlighter. Most text was rendered illegible by damage, but certain headers remained clear enough: coordinates, dates, and most tellingly, classification markings consistent with high-level security protocols. The hiker photographed each page from multiple angles before carefully returning the clipboard to its original position. Disturbing potential evidence wasn't ideal, but documentation took precedence. Deeper within the wreckage, he discovered the second compelling piece of evidence: a storage case, partially crushed, but with contents still secure. Inside lay what appeared to be specialized equipment, devices with no obvious commercial equivalent. One resembled a sophisticated sensor array. Another looked like an advanced communication device, unlike any consumer or standard military hardware he'd encountered in media coverage or documentation. Most unsettling was a sealed container marked with biohazard symbols and technical terminology that meant nothing to him. This he photographed extensively, but left completely undisturbed, maintaining maximum distance once documentation was complete. The third discovery proved most personal, and perhaps most disturbing. A section that might have served as crew quarters contained personal effects: a leather wallet with identification documents, a tablet device somehow still intact within a specialized protective case, and a small frame containing what appeared to be a family photograph. The hiker documented these items with particular care, ensuring the identification details were clearly captured while feeling an uncomfortable sense of intrusion. These were not abstract pieces of equipment, but evidence of lives, individuals connected to whatever operation this aircraft had been conducting. The photograph showed smiling faces, ordinary people with families who might not know their true work. This humanizing element sharpened the gravity of his discovery. As daylight began to fade, the hiker completed his documentation and retreated from the wreckage. Back at a safe distance, he reviewed the images on his camera's display, confirming he had thorough coverage before packing the equipment. The decision to contact authorities weighed heavily. By every standard protocol for discovering a crash site, immediate reporting was mandatory. Yet the nature of this particular wreckage, combined with the baffling absence of prior official response, raised troubling questions. He opted for the most straightforward approach, following established procedure while maintaining his documentation as insurance. Using his satellite messenger device, a precaution for emergencies in areas without cellular coverage, he sent a basic alert with coordinates and a brief description. Aircraft wreckage discovered. Appears significant. No signs of recent crash or rescue operation. The response came more quickly than anticipated. Within 20 minutes, as he was establishing a temporary camp a safe distance from the site, his device pinged with an acknowledgement from the Regional Forest Service dispatch. Message received. Remain at safe distance. Ranger team will make contact by morning. Provide additional details about your identity and purpose in area. The hiker complied, sending his backcountry permit number and basic information. The subsequent response struck him as oddly formulaic, a request to remain in place, assurance that qualified personnel would arrive, and a reminder that approaching crash sites could be hazardous. No questions about the aircraft type, no urgent requests for details about potential survivors, though he'd clearly indicated this didn't appear to be a recent crash. The bureaucratic neutrality of the response heightened his unease. As darkness enveloped the mountains, he established his camp on a small ledge overlooking the plateau, positioned to keep the crash site in view. Sleep would be impossible despite his physical exhaustion. Too many questions crowded his thoughts. How had an aircraft of this size come down without triggering a massive search operation? Why did the technology inside appear so advanced yet unfamiliar? Most troubling, why did documentation inside bear classification markings that suggested government involvement, yet the crash remained unmarked and unacknowledged? The hiker checked his camera again, confirming the images were intact, then connected it to his portable power bank to ensure the battery remained charged. The documentation he'd gathered might prove vital, not just to whatever investigation would follow, but potentially as protection. 19 years in these mountains had honed his instincts, and something about this situation triggered every internal alarm. He'd always considered himself an ordinary citizen, someone who followed rules, respected authority, trusted the systems in place. But witnessing the contradiction between what clearly lay on this mountainside and what official narratives would suggest possible had shaken that foundation. Morning would bring official response, but until then he maintained his vigil. Whatever had fallen from the sky onto this remote mountainside carried secrets. Secrets significant enough that their revelation might indeed, as the title so accurately predicted, shock the nation. As the night deepened around him, the hiker made a decision. When authorities arrived, he would cooperate fully, but the documentation would remain secure. Something told him that the truth of what lay in twisted metal on the plateau might be the first casualty once official protocols engaged. In the darkness, he waited, a solitary figure keeping watch over a discovery that would forever change him, and potentially much more. Dawn broke over the mountains with an ominous crimson glow that painted the cloud-streaked sky. The hiker had not slept. His vigilant watch over the crash site had extended through the longest night of his life, his mind racing with theories each more unsettling than the last. The satellite messenger device remained silent. No further communications from the Forest Service dispatch since their initial exchange. By 8:30 a.m., with no sign of the promised ranger team, he made the decision to descend to the nearest ranger station himself. Before departing, he photographed the crash site one final time in the revealing morning light, then secured his most important evidence, the memory card from his camera, in a waterproof case strapped against his body beneath his clothing. The original remained in the camera, a decoy if necessary. 19 years in the wilderness had taught him to prepare for the unexpected, but never had those preparations felt so vital. The descent took 4 hours, a journey marked by frequent glances over his shoulder and pauses to listen for unusual sounds. Twice he diverted from the main trail, taking game paths through denser vegetation, an instinctive precaution that seemed increasingly justified with each passing hour. The absence of the promised response team suggested something beyond mere bureaucratic delay. The ranger station, when he finally reached it, appeared oddly deserted for midday. A single government-issue SUV sat in the gravel lot, Forest Service insignia dulled by dust. The hiker approached the main entrance with measured steps, his pack still secured to his back, despite the fatigue in his shoulders. The building's silence matched that of the mountain plateau where the jet lay hidden. Inside, a lone ranger sat behind the reception desk, fingers tapping at a keyboard with mechanical disinterest. The young man, perhaps 30, with the fresh-faced look of someone new to the service, glanced up briefly, his expression shifting from boredom to wariness. "Can I help you?" The question carried a formality that felt rehearsed. The hiker chose his words carefully. "I sent an alert yesterday about finding what appeared to be a crash site. I was told a team would meet me by morning." The ranger's eyes flickered to his computer screen, then back. "We have no record of any dispatch team being authorized for today. What's your permit number?" After providing the information, the hiker watched the ranger's expression carefully as he entered it into the system. A micro-expression, too brief to be intentional, crossed the younger man's features. Recognition, followed by what might have been concern. There's nothing here about a crash report. Just your standard backcountry permit. The ranger's voice remained steady, but his eyes no longer met the hiker's. If you encountered something concerning, I can take a report now. Something wasn't right. The hiker had received confirmation of his report, had engaged in a text exchange with someone at dispatch. That record couldn't simply have vanished. He made a decision to retreat strategically, to gather more information before revealing what he knew. My mistake. Must have been spotty satellite connection creating confusion. I'll file a proper report later today after I've had some rest. The ranger nodded, relief visible in the loosening of his shoulders. The system gets glitchy in the backcountry. Happens all the time. The town nearest to the national forest boundary was a small community of roughly 5,000 residents, primarily a service center for outdoor recreation and seasonal tourism. The hiker knew it moderately well from previous expeditions, enough to navigate directly to the County Historical Society, housed in a repurposed Victorian-era home on the main street. Inside, the building maintained the hushed atmosphere common to small archives worldwide, the universal quiet of preserved knowledge rarely accessed. Climate control struggled against the afternoon heat, creating a slight dampness that clung to the displayed photographs and documents. An elderly volunteer looked up from her desk, reading glasses perched midway down her nose. "Welcome to the Historical Society. Looking for anything in particular today?" Her voice carried the welcoming tone of someone who rarely received visitors. The hiker approached the desk, lowering his voice instinctively. "I'm researching incidents in the national forest, particularly in the northwestern sector. Aircraft incidents, military operations, anything unusual in that region." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's quite specific. Any particular time period?" "As far back as records go. I'm particularly interested in the 1960s through 1980s. The decades seemed the most likely period for whatever operation might have preceded the crash he'd discovered based on the age of the wreckage." The volunteer led him to a climate-controlled room in the back of the building, where county records, newspaper archives, and donated historical materials were organized in metal filing cabinets and acid-free boxes. She pulled several containers labeled by decade. The local paper ran continuously from 1954 until switching to digital only in 2018. "We have the complete archive here. Military operations would have been noteworthy enough to report, even if details were sparse." She gestured to another section. "Land usage records there might show any federal acquisitions or restrictions. Good luck." For 3 hours, the hiker methodically combed through the materials. Initially, nothing seemed relevant. Tourist developments, local politics, weather disasters. Then, in a folder of newspaper clippings from 1978, he found the first thread to pull. The headline was modest: "Forest access restricted for scientific research." The article detailed the closure of a substantial section of the national forest, including the area where he'd found the crash, for what was described as atmospheric research in partnership with federal agencies. Local hunters had apparently protested the timing, which coincided with elk season. The closure had lasted 18 months. From there, he found more fragments. A brief mention in a 1979 town council meeting record. Discussion of increased air traffic over restricted zone. Complaint forwarded to federal liaison. A classified advertisement seeking technical personnel for government project. Security clearance required, that ran for 6 weeks in 1980. Most compelling was a feature article from 1981 titled "Mystery Lights Explained," with an accompanying blurry photograph showing what appeared to be unusual illumination over the mountain range. The article quoted a Forest Service spokesperson attributing the phenomenon to authorized testing of weather monitoring equipment. The hiker carefully photographed each document with his phone, methodically building a timeline that suggested a pattern. A significant federal presence in the exact area where the jet now lay crashed, active primarily between 1978 and 1984, with repeated references to atmospheric research and testing. A final discovery came from a donated collection of personal papers from a deceased county commissioner. In a folder of correspondence from 1983, a handwritten note on federal letterhead thanked the commissioner for his continued discretion regarding operations in the research zone, and assured that all activities will conclude by fiscal year 1985 with minimal environmental impact. But most telling was what he didn't find. No record of any major crash, no emergency response, no recovery operation that would align with the wreckage he'd discovered. Whatever had happened on that mountain had either occurred after the documented operation ended or had been completely scrubbed from public record. As the Historical Society prepared to close for the day, the volunteer approached his table. "Find what you were looking for?" "Maybe. Do you know anything about a research facility operating in the forest during that period? Something federal, possibly military?" She hesitated, glancing around though they were alone in the room. "My late husband worked for the Forest Service back then. He wasn't allowed to talk about it, but he mentioned once that there was a facility up near Silver Ridge. Said it was officially a weather research station, but..." She shrugged. The amount of security didn't match the cover story. "Why the interest after all these years?" "Just researching local history," the hiker replied, maintaining a casual tone. "Is the facility still there?" "Officially decommissioned in '85. The access road was reclaimed by the forest. Some hikers find the concrete foundations sometimes, but there's nothing left worth seeing." She studied him with sudden intensity. At least that's the official line. With daylight fading, the hiker made one final stop before securing accommodation for the night. The location the volunteer had mentioned, Silver Ridge, lay in the same general area as the crash site, but on the opposite side of the mountain face. If a facility had operated there, it might explain the sophisticated nature of the aircraft he'd discovered. The Forest Service maps sold in the local outdoor outfitter showed no trace of any access road or facility, but an older state geological survey map framed on the shop's wall still indicated a service road 177B, reaching into the area in question. The hiker photographed this as well, then purchased supplies for another backcountry trip, this time with a different destination in mind. Pre-dawn light found the hiker already miles into the forest, following the faint trace of what had once been Service Road 177B. Nature had reclaimed most of the path, but the topographical contours of an engineered road remained visible to his experienced eye. Cuts into hillsides too precise to be natural, drainage patterns that followed civil engineering principles rather than the random path of erosion. He had chosen to approach from the opposite side of the mountain range from his previous ascent, reasoning that any facility would have required vehicle access. Unlike the remote crash site, the remnants of the road confirmed his theory, though decades of forest growth had reduced it to little more than a game trail in most sections. By mid-morning, he reached a clearing that nature had not fully reclaimed. Concrete foundations emerged from the earth like the exposed bones of a massive skeleton, forming the outline of what had once been a substantial complex. The hiker moved methodically through the ruins, documenting the layout. The main structure had covered approximately 20,000 square feet, far larger than any standard Forest Service building. Smaller outbuildings formed a perimeter, their foundations suggesting security checkpoints. Most telling was a large circular foundation with mounting brackets still embedded in the concrete, consistent with a substantial satellite dish or similar communication equipment. As he photographed the complex, the hiker noted something unusual. While vegetation had overtaken most of the ruins, certain areas showed signs of recent clearing. Fresh machete cuts on vines, newly broken branches. Someone had visited the site recently, and with purpose. He followed these disturbances to a section where one foundation extended into the hillside. Here, the fresh activity was most apparent. The entrance to what appeared to be a bunker or underground section had been recently accessed. The accumulated debris of decades partially cleared away. The opening was narrow, requiring him to remove his pack and push it ahead of him. His headlamp illuminated a short concrete tunnel ending at a heavy metal door. Partially open, its locking mechanism apparently damaged long ago. Beyond lay darkness. Caution warred with curiosity. Every instinct honed through years in the wilderness urged retreat, yet the potential connection to the crashed aircraft compelled him forward. The hiker checked his satellite messenger. No signal, as expected in an underground structure. He was truly alone. Slipping through the gap in the door, his headlamp revealed a scene of abandonment and decay. A room approximately 40 feet square contained rusted filing cabinets, decaying office furniture, and equipment racks stripped of their contents. Water damage had destroyed most paper documents, creating a pulpy mass across sections of the floor. But in one corner, something jarred against the scene of neglect. A modern portable generator, connected to what appeared to be high-capacity hard drives and networking equipment. The setup was dusty but operational. Power indicators glowed green in the darkness. Someone had established a modern data system within the abandoned facility, and recently, the hiker photographed everything, then examined the equipment more closely. The hard drives bore no manufacturer logos, just alphanumeric codes. Cables connected them to a device he couldn't identify, something resembling a server but unlike commercial models he'd seen. Most troubling was a small black box mounted on the wall above, a surveillance camera, its lens oriented toward the entrance. He had been recorded the moment he entered. Heart racing, the hiker completed his documentation rapidly, then investigated a second door leading deeper into the hillside. This one remained securely locked, with an electronic keypad that appeared functional, another anachronism in the otherwise abandoned facility. Without tools or the code, proceeding further was impossible. He discovered enough to confirm his suspicions. Whatever operation had officially ended in 1985 had continued in some capacity and was still active in some form. The crashed aircraft in this facility were connected, part of something that remained operational decades after its official conclusion. He retreated from the bunker, carefully covering signs of his entry by repositioning the debris at the entrance. Once outside, he checked his GPS coordinates and compared them to the location of the crash site. The relationship was clear. The facility lay almost exactly 5 miles from the crash location, on the same mountain system, but on the opposite face. Anyone monitoring the equipment he'd discovered inside would have easy access to the crash site via the ridgeline. As he prepared to depart, something caught his eye. A glint of metal among the leaves approximately 20 yards from the bunker entrance. Investigating, he discovered a surveillance camera, disguised as a trail marker, positioned to monitor the approach to the facility. Its modern construction and fresh mounting screws indicated recent installation. The hiker photographed it without disturbing its position, then began a careful retreat, taking an alternate route away from the facility to avoid any additional surveillance equipment. His initial discovery of the crashed jet now appeared part of something far larger, an operation spanning decades, officially terminated but clearly continuing in secret. The hiker returned to town after dark, fatigue weighing his steps but mind racing with implications. He'd checked into a small motel on the outskirts the previous night, the type of establishment that asked few questions and accepted cash. After a brief stop at a 24-hour diner to refuel with calories and caffeine, he returned to his room to review his findings. The key turned in the lock, but as the door swung open, he immediately sensed something was wrong. Though nothing appeared obviously disturbed, the atmosphere of the room had changed, the subtle shift that occurs when someone has entered a space in your absence. Moving cautiously, he scanned the room, noting that his backpack remained where he'd left it, apparently untouched. His laptop, an older model used primarily for transferring photos, sat closed on the small desk. Then he saw it, a plain white envelope propped against the base of the bedside lamp. It had not been there when he left. The envelope contained a single sheet of white paper with a typed message. "You've strayed into restricted areas twice now. Your satellite communications have been logged. Your permit does not cover the areas you've accessed. This is your only warning to cease investigation of government property. Further trespassing will result in federal charges." No signature, no letterhead, just the message, clinical and threatening. The hiker's first reaction was to check his documentation. The memory card secured against his body remained untouched, but when he opened his laptop and inserted the camera's primary card, he found the files corrupted, thumbnails visible but full-size images unreadable. His phone, when checked, had been completely wiped to factory settings. Someone had not only entered his room, but had specifically targeted his documentation while leaving him a warning. The violation sent a chill through him more profound than any mountain storm he'd weathered. His decades of backcountry experience had prepared him for environmental threats, not human ones. Morning found him at the regional FBI field office in the nearest city, an hour's drive from the small town. The building's modern glass facade projected transparency and accessibility, a stark contrast to his reception inside. The front desk officer directed him to a waiting area after taking basic information. 30 minutes passed before a field agent, a woman in her early 40s with the composed demeanor of someone who had heard countless implausible stories, escorted him to an interview room. "I understand you have information about a restricted government facility?" Her tone was professionally neutral. For the next 20 minutes, the hiker presented his findings: the crashed aircraft, the abandoned yet still operational facility, the surveillance equipment, and finally, the warning left in his motel room. He provided the memory card containing his original documentation, explaining how his other evidence had been corrupted or destroyed. The agent took notes without comment, her expression revealing nothing. When he finished, she closed her notebook and folded her hands. What you've described sounds like you discovered an old NOAA weather research station that was decommissioned decades ago. These installations were common in mountainous regions during the Cold War. As for the aircraft, the Forest Service occasionally conducts aerial surveys that could explain what you saw. The dismissal was so complete, so rehearsed, that it momentarily left him speechless. His extensive documentation, the threatening note, the sophisticated technology he'd observed, all reduced to mundane explanations that ignored critical details. The aircraft contained classified documentation and advanced technology, he insisted. The facility had modern surveillance equipment and active data systems. Someone entered my room and left a threatening message after corrupting my evidence. None of that is explained by weather research. Mr. E. She glanced at her notes. I understand you're an experienced outdoorsman, but even experts can misinterpret unfamiliar equipment. What you've described as advanced technology is likely standard monitoring equipment. As for the note and your corrupted files, we can certainly investigate that as a potential break-in, but it's unlikely to be connected to federal operations. The conversation continued in this vein. His specific details met with generalized dismissals, his concerns redirected or minimized. When the agent returned his memory card, explaining that their technical division would need a formal request to analyze it, the message became clear. No help would come from this quarter. As he prepared to leave the field office, a young administrative assistant approached him in the lobby, ostensibly to return the visitor badge he'd forgotten to surrender. As she took the badge, she slipped a small folded paper into his palm, her eyes briefly meeting his with an intensity that contrasted with her casual movement. Once outside in the parking lot, he unfolded the note. Not the first report about that area. Previous inquiries shut down from above. Check with retired Ranger Davis at Pine Creek Nursing Home. Be careful. The nursing home sat on the outskirts of the small town, a single-story building with well-maintained gardens and the antiseptic smell common to such facilities worldwide. The retired ranger, a man in his early 70s with the leathery complexion of someone who had spent decades outdoors, received him in a small private room filled with photographs of mountain landscapes. Been waiting for someone like you to show up again, the former ranger stated after the hiker explained his presence. Happened in '93, again in 2007. Always the same pattern. Someone stumbles across something they shouldn't, starts asking questions, then either goes quiet or leaves the area suddenly. The ranger's gnarled hands trembled slightly as he pulled a small notebook from his bedside drawer. I kept records, unofficial ones. The official reports always disappeared from the system. Hikers reporting unusual aircraft, lights on the ridge at night, unmarked vehicles on service roads that were supposed to be decommissioned. He passed the notebook to the hiker. Take it. I'm not leaving this place except in a box, and my kids have no interest in old conspiracy theories from their father. But it's not theory, is it? You've seen it too. The notebook contained dates, coordinates, brief descriptions of reported incidents, a chronicle spanning 3 decades, meticulously documented by someone within the system who had recognized the pattern. The final entry was dated just 6 months prior. Nightlights reported again. Same coordinates as 85 incident. Report filed. Report deleted from system next day. As dusk approached, the hiker returned to his motel to find a second envelope. This one slipped under his door rather than left inside the room. The message was more direct. Final warning. Memory card copied. Further disclosure attempts will result in immediate arrest under national security provisions. Vehicle registered at FBI office tracked. Leave town by morning or face consequences. The escalation was clear, as was the implication that he was under active surveillance. Whoever was monitoring him had resources and authority extending beyond local jurisdiction. They knew he had gone to the FBI and had tracked his subsequent movements. The hiker sat on the edge of the bed, turning the retired ranger's notebook in his hands. 2 decades in the wilderness had taught him to respect threats, from weather, terrain, wildlife, but it had also taught him resilience and resourcefulness. There was a story here that powerful interests wanted suppressed, one important enough to maintain secrecy for decades. He made his decision. Packing only essential items into his backpack, he left most of his gear in the room, a decoy suggesting he remained there. Through the back exit of the motel, he slipped into the gathering darkness, using skills honed in the backcountry to move unobserved toward the bus station. His destination wasn't away from the story, but toward greater resources. The contact information for an investigative journalist at a national publication was already entered in the burner phone he'd purchased that afternoon. Cash only, no connection to his identity. The memory card with his original documentation was secured in a waterproof container, along with the retired ranger's notebook. As the last bus of the evening departed the small town, the hiker sat in the rear seat, eyes constantly scanning for followers. The crashed aircraft, the abandoned yet active facility, the decades of covered-up incidents, all pieces of a puzzle that powerful interests had successfully kept fragmented, until now. Whatever lay in those mountains had remained hidden through systematic intimidation and institutional complicity. But the hiker had spent his life navigating treacherous terrain, finding paths where others saw only obstacles. This journey would be his most dangerous yet, not against the indifferent hazards of nature, but against adversaries with resources and determination matching his own. The truth would emerge, whatever the personal cost. Some summits demanded everything from those determined to reach them. The metropolis enveloped the hiker in anonymity, a welcome shield after days of surveillance and threats. 300 miles from the mountain range that had become both his obsession and potential downfall, he found temporary sanctuary in the urban landscape. The investigative journalist had responded to his encrypted message with cautious interest, arranging a meeting in 2 days' time, but the waiting proved unbearable. The evidence he carried demanded more immediate action. In a budget hotel room paid for in cash under no name, the hiker spread his remaining documentation across the bed, the memory card with original photographs, the retired ranger's notebook, and handwritten notes reconstructing what had been deleted from his devices. The collection seemed simultaneously damning and fragile, substantial yet vulnerable to those determined to suppress it. 19 years of backcountry experience had instilled a fundamental principle: never venture into hazardous terrain without preparation and backup plans. This situation, though urban, demanded the same precautions. The hiker purchased a prepaid laptop from an electronics store, using it to create multiple copies of his evidence, some uploaded to encrypted cloud storage services, others transferred to new memory cards purchased with cash. If I disappear, follow these coordinates. The hiker spoke quietly into the camera of the prepaid laptop, recording a video testament that outlined his discoveries, the threats received, and the connections he'd established between the crashed aircraft and the abandoned facility. The aircraft contains classified technology and documents that contradict official government positions. The facility, though reportedly decommissioned in 1985, remains operational with modern surveillance equipment. Someone is maintaining both sites and actively suppressing discovery. He transferred the video to a memory card, then drafted an email scheduled to send automatically in 72 hours unless canceled. A digital dead man's switch addressed to 3 recipients: the investigative journalist, a prominent civil liberties attorney whose contact information he'd found online, and his former search and rescue colleague who now worked as a wilderness guide. The email contained download links to his evidence and a message explaining the circumstances. If he failed to return, the truth would still emerge. With digital precautions established, the hiker turned to physical preparation. His years traversing remote wilderness had built an instinctive checklist for survival situations. This mission, returning to the crash site for final, irrefutable documentation, represented the most dangerous terrain he'd ever navigated, not for its environmental hazards, but for the human adversaries now actively monitoring the area. He methodically inspected his equipment, a lightweight but durable pack containing minimal survival gear, a new high-resolution camera with night vision capabilities, additional battery packs, a satellite phone different from his previous device, a handheld GPS unit, and emergency medical supplies, each item selected for maximum utility with minimal weight. The discipline of backcountry travel applied to a very different kind of expedition. The hiker contacted his colleague from the former search and rescue team, not revealing specifics but ensuring someone knew his general whereabouts and expected timeline. Just checking some unusual features on the Northwest Ridge system, he explained vaguely during their brief call from a public phone. If you don't hear from me by Friday, that's unusual. The colleague, experienced enough to recognize the subtext, asked the appropriate questions. Standard route or variation? Weather report check? Overnight gear? Variation from standard approach. Weather clear for 72 hours. Full overnight capability for 5 days. Solo, as usual. The exchange, mundane to any listening ears, conveyed the essential information between seasoned wilderness professionals. Non-standard approach, extended timeline, prepared for contingencies, but concerned enough to establish a check-in protocol. "I'll expect Friday then," the colleague confirmed. Good navigation. Transportation presented the final challenge. The hiker purchased a used motorcycle from a private seller, cash transaction, minimal paperwork, providing mobility without the trackable signature of rental vehicles or public transportation. The journey back to the mountain range would take approximately 5 hours, time to arrive after dark. As dusk approached on the outskirts of the city, the hiker completed final preparations. The memory cards containing the most critical evidence were secured in waterproof containers, distributed throughout his clothing and gear. Redundancy, ensuring that even if partially compromised, some record would survive. His route was planned to approach the mountain range from an entirely different access point than his previous entries, utilizing unmaintained hunting trails and natural features to avoid established routes potentially under surveillance. The weight of the situation settled over him as he straddled the motorcycle. Unlike his normal wilderness expeditions, undertaken with the calm meditation of someone pursuing passion, this departure carried a gravity that tightened his chest and sharpened his senses. The threatening notes, the corrupted evidence, the institutional dismissal of his concerns, all confirmed the significance of what he'd discovered and the determination of those protecting it. The motorcycle's engine rumbled to life, vibrating through his body like a physical manifestation of the tension coursing through him. As he pulled away from the city, merging with highway traffic flowing toward the distant mountains now silhouetted against the sunset, the hiker committed himself to completion of the journey. Whatever lay waiting in those mountains, whatever truth the crashed aircraft and abandoned facility contained, would be revealed, regardless of personal consequence. The approach to the mountain range under moonless night sky required all the navigational skill the hiker had developed across 2 decades in the wilderness, traveling without headlights for the final miles on Forest Service roads, relying on night-adjusted vision and intimate knowledge of how such roads followed topographical contours. He reached his selected entry point well after midnight. He concealed the motorcycle beneath a natural overhang, camouflaged with branches and forest debris, a technique learned from wilderness survival training, now applied for very different reasons. The GPS unit, displaying only coordinates without connecting to external networks that might be monitored, confirmed his position relative to both the crashed aircraft and the abandoned facility. The hiker's plan targeted neither location directly. His previous explorations and the retired ranger's notes had revealed a third site, a smaller structure indicated in the historical records as an auxiliary monitoring station, connected to the main facility. Positioned higher on the ridge system, this location would offer both comprehensive documentation opportunities and potential access to information about the entire operation. The ascent through dense forest in near-total darkness demanded precision and patience. Moving without artificial light to avoid detection, the hiker navigated by feel and memory, each step carefully placed to minimize sound. 3 hours of methodical climbing brought him to a vantage point above the auxiliary station as the first hint of pre-dawn light touched the eastern horizon. Through high-powered binoculars, he surveyed the target, a structure smaller than the main facility, resembling a weather monitoring station with a reinforced concrete base and metal housing for equipment. Solar panels mounted on the roof indicated active power generation, while a small satellite dish confirmed communication capability. Most telling was the modern security camera mounted on a corner post, its housing too new to align with the station's supposed decommissioning decades earlier. The hiker documented the exterior thoroughly, then observed the site for 1 full hour, confirming no human presence. As dawn illuminated the mountains, he approached the station using natural features for cover. The door, unlike the compromised entrance to the main facility's underground section, featured an intact electronic security system with keypad access. Rather than attempting to breach the door, the hiker examined the structure's perimeter, finding what experienced backcountry travelers recognized in all human constructions exposed to harsh environments, compromise points where nature had begun reclamation. A section where the concrete foundation met the metal wall showed signs of erosion and frost heave, creating a gap just large enough to provide access to the understructure. Working methodically with tools from his pack, he enlarged the opening sufficiently to slip beneath the station. The space between foundation and floor was tight but navigable, requiring serpentine movement through dust and abandoned rodent nests. His headlamp, now safely used beneath the structure, revealed a maintenance access panel in the floor above. likely designed for servicing underfloor wiring and equipment. The panel opened with minimal resistance, allowing the hiker to emerge inside the station. What he found exceeded even his most alarming theories. The interior contained a sophisticated monitoring system far beyond weather research or environmental science. Multiple screens displayed real-time data streams, some showing surveillance footage from various points throughout the mountain range, including both the crash site and the main facility. Others presented what appeared to be atmospheric readings, radiation levels, and electromagnetic field measurements surrounding the crash site. Most significant was a secured terminal displaying what could only be described as retrieval operation planning. Detailed topographical maps showed the crash site with annotations indicating phased extraction scheduled to begin within 72 hours. Technical specifications for specialized equipment and personnel requirements suggested a major operation preparing to remove the aircraft and all evidence of its existence. But the terminal contained something far more revealing: files documenting the original project dating back to the 1970s. The hiker accessed these records, photographing screen after screen of classified information. The truth emerged with devastating clarity. The facility had never been for weather research. From its inception, the operation had focused on reverse engineering and adaptation of recovered technology not of conventional origin. The crashed aircraft contained experimental systems developed through this decades-long program, systems incorporating principles and components that contradicted publicly acknowledged scientific understanding. The documentation used terminology that avoided explicit statements about origins, but the implications were unmistakable in phrases like adapted from recovered materials and non-conventional technological principles. Most damning were risk assessment documents acknowledging potential public reaction if the program's existence became known, not merely for the classified nature of the research, but for the fundamental questions it would raise about government transparency regarding recovered non-conventional craft and technology. The hiker documented everything methodically, hands steady, despite the weight of what he was discovering. This explained the aggressive response to his accidental discovery. He had stumbled upon perhaps the most closely guarded secret operation in the country, one spanning decades, and potentially revealing a reality contrary to all official positions. As he photographed the final screen, a notification flashed across the display. Perimeter alert, east approach. Surveillance cameras showed a vehicle moving along the access road, a black SUV with government plates, still miles away but approaching rapidly. The hiker worked with controlled urgency, ensuring his documentation was complete and secured across multiple devices. He returned the terminal to its original display, closed the maintenance panel behind him, and slipped back through the foundation gap, carefully restoring it to appear undisturbed. From the cover of dense forest 50 yards from the structure, he watched through binoculars as the SUV arrived. Two figures emerged, men in unmarked tactical gear carrying sidearms and communication equipment. They performed a perimeter check before entering the station with keycard access. The hiker used this opportunity to retreat further into the tree line, beginning his descent via a different route than his approach. He had covered perhaps a mile when the sound of helicopter rotors echoed across the ridge. Dropping to a prone position beneath a dense stand of pines, he watched as a black helicopter passed overhead, following the access road toward the monitoring station. The response was escalating, suggesting either his intrusion had been detected or the retrieval operation was mobilizing ahead of schedule. The hiker abandoned his planned route, opting instead for a more direct descent through difficult terrain less likely to be monitored. The path required navigating near vertical sections of the mountainside, using tree roots and rock formations as handholds, the kind of route that would deter conventional pursuit. The sound of the helicopter returned, now executing a search pattern across the mountain face. The hiker pressed himself against a rock outcropping, using natural features for concealment as the aircraft passed within 100 yards, its downwash bending treetops. When it moved to the next search grid, he continued his descent with increased urgency. A stream crossing provided momentary advantage, moving through knee-deep water for several hundred yards to eliminate scent trails that pursuit dogs might follow. The cold mountain water numbed his lower extremities but provided crucial tactical advantage. Wilderness survival skills, honed for environmental emergencies, now served as evasion techniques. The helicopter's sound faded, then intensified repeatedly as it expanded its search pattern. Twice more the hiker took cover as it passed nearby, each time resuming movement the moment opportunity allowed. The descent became a primal exercise in terrain reading and natural concealment, drawing on every lesson learned across 2 decades in backcountry environments. 4 hours into the evasion, he reached the lower elevation where forest density provided better cover. The sounds of pursuit had diminished, suggesting the search had concentrated on higher elevations. The hiker maintained his pace, however, knowing that assumption of safety represented the greatest danger. This vigilance proved justified when he detected movement ahead, 2 figures in tactical gear moving methodically through the forest, communication devices in hand. The hiker froze in place, controlling his breathing as they passed within 30 yards of his position. Their search pattern suggested they were working a grid, methodically clearing sections of the mountainside. When they moved beyond visual range, he adjusted his route again, now moving parallel to the mountain face rather than continuing direct descent. This lateral movement took him across several drainage systems, further complicating any tracking effort. The physical demands intensified, scaling small cliff bands, fording additional streams, pushing through dense underbrush, but each obstacle increased distance from pursuers. By late afternoon, the hiker had reached a section of the national forest intersected by a popular hiking trail. Here, he emerged from his off-trail evasion route, adopting the casual gait and demeanor of a recreational hiker. 2-day hikers passed him on the trail, nodding in the universal acknowledgement between outdoor enthusiasts. Their presence confirmed he had reached relative safety. Pursuit would be constrained in areas with public witnesses. The trail led to a developed recreation area where weekend visitors picnicked beside their vehicles. The hiker maintained his measured pace through the area, showing no urgency despite the pounding of his heart. A family loading camping gear into their SUV provided final opportunity. The restroom building, where he quickly changed his outer layer of clothing to alter his visual signature, emerging looking like any other weekend outdoor enthusiast. From the recreation area, a Forest Service road connected to the highway system 10 miles distant. The hiker began walking this route, maintaining awareness of vehicles approaching from behind. When a pickup truck with mountain bikes in the bed slowed beside him, he accepted the offered ride with casual appreciation, claiming his own vehicle had developed mechanical issues. The truck driver, a mountain biker returning from weekend trails, drove him to a gas station at the highway junction, dropping him within sight of the rural bus stop serving the region. 40 minutes later, seated on a westbound bus carrying weekend tourists back to the city, the hiker finally allowed himself to acknowledge the magnitude of what he had discovered and documented. The memory cards distributed throughout his clothing and equipment contained evidence that would fundamentally alter public understanding of decades of government operations. The scheduled email with his video testament and evidence links remained unnecessary. He had survived to deliver the truth personally. As the bus merged onto the interstate highway, putting miles between him and the mountains that had revealed their extraordinary secret, the hiker checked the satellite phone. The journalist had confirmed their meeting for the following morning. The Metropolitan Library provided the perfect combination of public exposure and private conversation space. The hiker arrived an hour early, securing a study room with glass walls facing the main floor, visible to dozens of patrons while providing acoustic privacy. The setting represented both protection through publicity and immediate witnesses if intervention occurred. The investigative journalist arrived precisely on time, a woman in her late 30s with the measured movements and observant eyes of someone accustomed to operating in sensitive situations. No introductions were exchanged. Both recognized the other from previously shared photographs. "You look like you've had an interesting few days," she observed, noting the hiker's weathered appearance despite his attempts to present a conventional image in clean clothes purchased that morning. "The mountains are always interesting if you know where to look." He placed a sealed envelope on the table between them. "Everything's there. Memory cards with photographs, video documentation, coordinates, and my written statement." The retired ranger's notebook provides historical context for the operation dating back to the 70s. The journalist didn't touch the envelope immediately. "You mentioned classified technology in an aircraft crash site and an abandoned facility still under active operation. That's an extraordinary claim. The evidence is equally extraordinary." The hiker activated a tablet purchased that morning, displaying select images without handing over the device. "This is the crashed aircraft, containing technology developed through a decades-long classified program. These are screenshots from their own systems documenting the operation and its true purpose." The journalist studied the images, her professional detachment temporarily broken by widened eyes and a sharp intake of breath. If this is authenticated, it will be. I've included sufficient location data for independent verification, multiple sets of coordinates, approach routes, and time-stamped images establishing the continuing operation of supposedly decommissioned facilities. She finally took the envelope, securing it in an inner pocket of her jacket. You understand what happens next? This won't be a simple news story. Once published, it triggers protocols involving national security apparatus, congressional oversight committees, potentially international implications. The hiker nodded. I understand the magnitude. That's why the evidence has already been distributed to multiple recipients. Legal representatives, trusted colleagues, secure storage accessible if anything happens to me or the materials you now hold. The truth emerges regardless of what happens next. The journalist's expression reflected professional assessment. You've been methodical. That improves credibility and provides protection. The publication I represent will have technical experts and legal counsel review everything before publication, but based on what you've shown me, we're discussing a timeline of days, not weeks. There's urgency beyond journalistic timelines, the hiker explained. Documentation I discovered indicates a retrieval operation planned for the crash site, potentially already underway. The evidence at that location could be gone within days. This information visibly accelerated the journalist's mental calculations. I'll have the technical verification started today. Preliminary story approved by tomorrow. Publication likely within 48 hours, concurrent with delivery to oversight authorities. The meeting concluded with exchange of secure communication protocols and contingency plans. As they parted, the journalist offered a final assessment. In 20 years covering national security, I've never seen documentation this comprehensive of something this significant. Whatever happens next, the historical record has been permanently altered by what you discovered on that mountain. The following 36 hours unfolded with methodical precision. The journalist's technical experts authenticated the photographic evidence, confirming both the crash site's existence and the active operation of supposedly decommissioned facilities. Legal counsel reviewed the material, identifying specific classified programs and potential violations of congressional oversight requirements. The hiker monitored developments from a new location, a small apartment rented in cash through a private arrangement. The journalist maintained secure communication, updating him on verification progress and publication timelines. When confirmation came that the story would break the following morning, he felt not elation, but the weary relief of completing an arduous journey. The story detonated across media platforms with the force of a shaped charge. The leading headline, "Classified Program Concealed Decades of Advanced Technology Research," appeared simultaneously across major news organizations worldwide, accompanied by selected images from the hiker's documentation. The story detailed the crashed aircraft containing classified technology, the continuing operation of officially decommissioned facilities, and the decades-long program operating without proper oversight or disclosure. Public reaction matched the magnitude of the revelation. Social media platforms experienced unprecedented traffic volumes as the story spread. Political figures from across the spectrum issued demands for investigation and transparency. Former government employees began coming forward with supporting accounts of related programs they had glimpsed during their service. The official response materialized with remarkable speed. By mid-afternoon, the Federal Bureau of Investigation announced a special inquiry team deployment, while congressional oversight committees scheduled emergency sessions. Military helicopters were observed departing from multiple bases toward the mountain region, and the national forest surrounding the crash site was abruptly closed for what was termed emergency management operations. From the safety of distance, watching events unfold on news channels and digital platforms, the hiker experienced complex emotions. The vindication of truth emerging brought satisfaction, yet witnessing the system's convulsion as it confronted exposed deception carried a certain sorrow. The mountains he had loved for their pristine isolation were now the center of global attention, their secret finally revealed after decades of concealment. 3 days after publication, with the story still dominating global headlines and the mountain range now hosting what satellite imagery revealed to be a massive government operation, the journalist contacted him through their secure channel. Congressional investigators want direct testimony. They're offering full legal protection and identity shielding protocols. Your decision entirely, but your first-hand account would be powerful. The hiker considered the request. weighing personal safety against the opportunity to ensure the full truth entered official record. His response was characteristic of someone who had spent a lifetime measuring risk against necessity in wilderness environments. "I'll testify if identity protections are guaranteed in writing. The documentation speaks for itself, but context matters." They need to understand how ordinary observation by an experienced outdoorsman broke open something their oversight failed to detect for decades. As arrangements were made for his protected testimony, the hiker returned to the mountainside one final time, not to the crash site or facility now swarming with official personnel, but to a distant ridgeline offering panoramic views of the entire range. From this natural overlook, he watched helicopter activity around the crash site, vehicles moving along previously hidden access roads, and the massive operation now exposed to daylight after decades in shadow. "The mountains keep no secrets forever," he murmured to himself, the same habit of solitary verbal reflection that had accompanied him on countless wilderness journeys. The revelation had forever altered both the national consciousness and his relationship with these peaks that had been his sanctuary and passion for 19 years. As sunset painted the mountain range in amber and gold, the hiker shouldered his pack and began his descent toward where his vehicle waited. The journey that had begun with an accidental discovery had transformed into something far beyond personal experience, a revelation that would reshape institutional structures and public understanding for generations to come. The truth, like water following gravity's imperative down a mountain watershed, had found its inevitable path to light. That, the hiker reflected, was perhaps the most natural outcome of all. 6 months had passed since the story broke. Winter had descended upon the mountains and then reluctantly retreated, yielding to the first tentative signs of spring. Throughout this cycle of seasons, the hiker had watched as his accidental discovery transformed from headline news to historical watershed, an event that would delineate time into before and after for an entire nation. The congressional hearings had continued for 14 weeks. From a secured room, identity protected through voice modulation and visual screening, the hiker had provided 12 hours of testimony across 3 separate sessions. His first-hand account, methodical, detailed, supported by the extensive documentation he'd gathered, had become the foundation upon which the investigation built its understanding of what had occurred in those mountains for nearly 5 decades. What emerged through testimony from dozens of former program personnel, declassified documents, and forensic analysis of the crash site and facilities exceeded even the most alarming theories presented in initial news coverage. The operation had indeed begun in 1978 as the historical record suggested, but its origins reached back further, to recovered materials from an incident in the late 1960s that had remained completely absent from public records. The mountain facility had been established specifically to analyze, reverse engineer, and adapt technologies that defied conventional scientific understanding, all while maintaining absolute secrecy not merely from foreign adversaries but from domestic oversight mechanisms. The crashed aircraft discovered by the hiker represented the latest generation of experimental craft incorporating these adapted technologies, an unintended exposure of a program that had successfully remained hidden through 5 decades and 8 presidential administrations. The crash had occurred 18 months prior to the hiker's discovery, with the site deliberately left untouched while recovery strategies were developed that would leave no evidence. Most damning were the financial records ultimately uncovered by forensic accountants assigned to the congressional investigation. Billions of dollars had been channeled through classified appropriations, special access programs, and compartmentalized budgets, creating what the committee chair described as a self-perpetuating entity operating outside constitutional governance. The human cost emerged as well. Former personnel who had attempted to raise ethical concerns had faced consequences ranging from career destruction to suspicious accidents. Local residents who reported unusual activities too persistently had been subjected to surveillance, intimidation, and in 3 documented cases, involuntary psychiatric evaluation and detention. The retired ranger whose notebook had provided crucial historical context was invited to testify as well, his decades of careful documentation now validated as prescient rather than paranoid. From his wheelchair in the hearing room, the elderly man had spoken with the quiet dignity of someone finally witnessed in their long-held truth. Criminal indictments followed as investigation findings were referred to the Department of Justice. 27 former and current officials faced charges ranging from misappropriation of funds to conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Most significant was the arrest of the former facility director, now an executive with a major defense contractor, whose home contained additional classified documents detailing program activities intentionally concealed from congressional oversight. The mountain range itself had become a massive forensic operation. Temporary structures housed investigators, technical specialists, and security personnel. The crash site had been fully excavated, the aircraft removed to a secure facility where independent scientific assessment could document its technological anomalies. The underground portions of the main facility, sealed during the official decommissioning in 1985, had been reopened, revealing extensive laboratories and testing areas that had remained operational through concealed access points. For the surrounding community, the revelation brought economic upheaval alongside vindication. The small town nearest the national forest boundary experienced an influx of media, government personnel, and curiosity seekers that strained local infrastructure while bringing unprecedented revenue to businesses. Property values fluctuated wildly, some residents eager to sell to newcomers drawn by the area's newfound fame, others refusing any price for land that had been in families for generations. The Historical Society became an unexpected beneficiary, its archives now visited by researchers documenting the community's unwitting proximity to one of history's most significant classified operations. The elderly volunteer who had first directed the hiker to relevant records now coordinated a growing collection of community experiences, locals finally sharing long-held stories of unusual sightings, strange encounters, and inexplicable events previously dismissed as imagination or confusion. Nationally, the revelation catalyzed a fundamental reassessment of government secrecy protocols and oversight mechanisms. Congressional committees initiated the most comprehensive reform of classification systems and special access programs since the National Security Act of 1947. Public hearings featured testimony from constitutional scholars, transparency advocates, and former intelligence officials arguing for a new framework, balancing legitimate security concerns against democratic accountability. The international response proved equally significant. Allied governments issued formal diplomatic inquiries regarding technology sharing agreements potentially violated by the classified program. The United Nations Security Council convened a special session addressing implications for international security frameworks. Scientific communities worldwide began reassessing established paradigms in light of the technological principles demonstrated in the recovered aircraft. Throughout this unfolding process of institutional reckoning, the hiker maintained his protected status, identity shielded through protocols typically reserved for high-value intelligence assets. He observed the consequences of his discovery from a position of anonymity, providing additional testimony when requested, but otherwise remaining outside the public spotlight that surrounded the investigation. 6 months into this continuing process, the president addressed the nation in a primetime broadcast watched by the largest audience in television history. From the Oval Office, with the gravity appropriate to a fundamental breach of public trust, the nation's highest official acknowledged the decades of deception, promised comprehensive reforms, and announced the establishment of a special oversight body comprising both government officials and civilian specialists to monitor the continuing investigation. The magnitude of this concealment represents a profound failure of our most basic democratic principles, the president stated. The systems designed to prevent exactly this type of unaccountable operation failed at multiple levels across multiple decades. Reform is not optional. It is imperative if we are to rebuild the trust upon which governance in a free society depends. From the protected location where he viewed this address, the hiker felt no triumph or vindication, only the weary relief that truth, however difficult, had finally emerged into the light. The ceremony was held in the East Room of the White House, though the hiker entered through a secure underground access point, his identity still protected from cameras and public view. 1 month after the presidential address, this private recognition had been arranged at the insistence of congressional leadership, an acknowledgement of the courage required to expose a system powerful enough to have destroyed his life, had circumstances unfolded differently. Only 30 people attended, key congressional investigators, Justice Department officials, and selected journalists, including the investigative reporter who had published the initial revelations. The hiker stood behind a privacy screen as the president presented a special congressional medal to his legal representative, a symbolic transfer that maintained his anonymity while acknowledging his service to democratic principles. The individual we honor today exemplifies the highest traditions of civic responsibility, the president stated. When confronted with evidence of operations contrary to our nation's foundational principles, this citizen chose the difficult path of exposure rather than the simpler road of silence. Without their courage, without their persistence in the face of intimidation and institutional resistance, we would remain unaware of serious breaches in our democratic systems. The medal, accepted on his behalf, would remain in a secure location until the protection protocols eventually expired. The hiker had requested that any monetary award accompanying the recognition be directed instead to establishing a legal defense fund for whistleblowers exposing government misconduct, a structure that would outlast his individual case and serve others who might face similar difficult choices. After the ceremony, in a secured conference room, the hiker met privately with the congressional committee chair, a veteran legislator whose decades of public service had not prepared them for the magnitude of what the investigation had revealed. "I've been in government oversight for 27 years, the senior legislator confided, "and I never imagined something of this scale could remain hidden for so long." The compartmentalization was brilliant in its effectiveness, each person seeing only their small piece, never the whole. The hiker nodded, understanding the institutional failure from his own experience. Systems designed by people can be manipulated by people. The mountains taught me that natural systems have inherent checks and balances. When one element becomes too dominant, counterforces eventually emerge. "That's profound," the legislator acknowledged. "And you were the counterforce in this case. Have you considered what comes next for you personally? The protection protocols won't be necessary forever. Eventually, you'll need to decide whether to emerge publicly or maintain your privacy." The question had occupied the hiker's thoughts throughout the months of testimony and investigation. His life had been fundamentally altered, not just by the discovery itself, but by the subsequent journey through institutional resistance, threat, vindication, and now this strange liminal space of being simultaneously recognized and hidden. "I haven't decided," he admitted. "Part of me wants to return to my former life, the simplicity of the wilderness, the work I built over decades. But that life doesn't exist anymore, not unchanged. The mountains will look different to me now, knowing what they concealed for so long." The legislator nodded with understanding. Few people experience this kind of inflection point, where a single discovery fundamentally alters not just their own trajectory, but that of an entire nation. Whatever you decide, you've earned the right to that choice. Later, alone in the secure accommodation arranged for him in the capital, the hiker reflected on the true cost of his discovery. The professional reputation built across 19 years of wilderness work remained intact but transformed. Colleagues now knew him as the unnamed individual who had exposed the operation, changing their perception in ways he couldn't fully assess while maintaining anonymity. His family relationships had experienced strain despite careful protection of their connection to him. His teenage children had watched the unfolding national story, knowing their father stood at its center, but unable to acknowledge this reality to friends or teachers. His former spouse had been supportive but concerned about potential long-term consequences for all of them, however robust the protection protocols. Most profound was the internal transformation, the shift in how he understood the relationship between wilderness and civilization. The mountains had been his sanctuary, a space where natural laws operated with transparent cause and effect, where challenges were physical rather than ethical. Now those same peaks held a more complex significance, still beautiful, still powerful, but also revealed as settings where human deception had operated alongside natural processes. The hiker moved to the window of his secured room, looking out at the capital city spread below, the institutional architecture housing the very systems that had both concealed and eventually exposed what lay hidden in his mountains. The duality struck him as appropriate somehow. These human constructions, like the natural formations he had navigated for decades, containing both grandeur and flaws, both inspiration and danger. "The truth matters," he murmured to himself, the solitary verbal reflection that had accompanied him on countless wilderness journeys now emerging in this very different terrain. However difficult, however costly, the truth matters. 18 months after his discovery, the hiker returned to professional work, not in the same region where events had unfolded, but in another wilderness area across the country. The protection protocols remained active, but had been modified to allow resumption of employment within his field of expertise. His identity in this new location was supported by appropriate documentation, his background adjusted to explain his sudden appearance in the professional community. He had accepted a position with a conservation organization assessing wilderness areas for potential protection status, work that utilized his technical skills while supporting principles that had guided his life before the discovery. His colleagues knew him only as an experienced backcountry specialist transferred from another region. The partial deception felt uncomfortable but necessary, a compromise between resuming meaningful work and maintaining the security still deemed essential by those overseeing his case. The new mountain range offered its own majesty, different geological character, different ecosystem, but governed by the same natural principles he had studied throughout his career. The physical demands of the work remained familiar and welcome, the daily navigation of challenging terrain reconnecting him to capabilities momentarily overshadowed by congressional hearings and legal procedures. Yet his perception had altered in ways impossible to reverse. Where once he had moved through wilderness focused primarily on immediate environmental factors, he now found himself scanning ridgelines for anything anomalous, studying terrain formations with an eye for what might be concealed, rather than simply appreciating their natural beauty. The innocence of his previous relationship with wilderness had been permanently altered. This transformation extended to his interaction with institutional structures as well. Government agencies he had previously regarded as bureaucratic but fundamentally trustworthy now triggered instinctive caution. Documentation that might once have seemed merely tedious now presented itself as potentially concealing deeper realities. The veil had been lifted, revealing systems more complex and potentially compromised than his pre-discovery consciousness could have imagined. On the anniversary of his initial finding, 2 full years since the moment his binoculars had detected the metallic glint among the rocks, the hiker requested leave from his new position. The protection team assigned to his case registered concern but ultimately approved the journey with appropriate security measures. He would return to the original mountains, not to the crash site itself, now a restricted area still under investigation, but to nearby peaks from which he could observe the transformed landscape. The return journey carried emotional weight beyond anything he had anticipated. Each mile closer to the familiar mountain range intensified both memory and awareness of change. The small town near the national forest boundary had expanded visibly. New construction accommodating the ongoing investigation, tourism centered on the revelation, and permanent facilities for the Oversight Commission established to ensure transparency in the continuing research. The Historical Society, once housed in its Victorian building on the main street, now occupied a modern facility with climate-controlled archives and interactive exhibits documenting both the classified operation and the community's unwitting proximity to history. The elderly volunteer who had first assisted his research greeted him with the polite interest shown to any visitor, unaware that she spoke to the individual whose discovery had transformed her institution and community. Access to the national forest remained restricted in the areas surrounding the crash site and facility locations, but adjacent wilderness areas had reopened to public use. The hiker secured necessary permits under his protected identity, then began the ascent of a peak offering views of the now famous ridgeline, where the aircraft had remained hidden for 18 months before his discovery. The climb felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, the physical characteristics of the mountain unchanged, but his relationship to it fundamentally altered. He recognized tree formations, rock outcroppings, the behavior of wildlife unchanged by the human drama that had unfolded in their habitat. Nature continued its processes indifferent to the revelation that had transformed human understanding. From the summit, with late afternoon light casting long shadows across the landscape, he could see the restricted zone where the crash site and facility had been located. Now the area hosted temporary structures housing the continuing investigation. Technical equipment, security perimeters, helicopter landing zones. What had been among the most isolated sections of the wilderness had become, ironically, among the most closely monitored and populated. The hiker seated himself on a boulder facing the transformed landscape, allowing memory to overlay present reality. He recalled the unnatural silence that had first drawn him toward the ridge where the aircraft lay concealed, the moment of discovery that had irreversibly altered his understanding of both wilderness and civilization. The mountains had kept their secret for decades before revealing it to him through circumstance and his own attentiveness, a revelation that had carried him through threat, vindication, and now this strange liminal existence between his former life and whatever might eventually emerge. "I didn't choose this," he spoke aloud, the habit of solitary verbal reflection returning in this moment of private recognition. "But I couldn't have chosen differently once I knew." As shadows lengthened and temperature dropped with approaching evening, the hiker prepared for descent. The investigation would continue for years, perhaps decades, as the full implications of the program were documented, the technology analyzed, the accountability process completed. His role, however, had reached a natural conclusion. He had discovered, documented, reported, and testified. The systems designed to pursue truth and justice, however flawed and initially resistant, had eventually engaged. What remained belonged to institutions and processes larger than any individual. Yet questions lingered that no investigation would likely resolve completely. Why had the aircraft crashed in the first place? What had the program discovered that justified decades of secrecy and billions in concealed funding? Most troubling, was this isolated case exceptional or merely one example of what might exist in other remote locations, other classified programs, other compartmentalized operations? The hiker had no answers to these larger questions and had come to accept that complete resolution might never arrive. His contribution had been specific and bounded, revealing one hidden reality in one mountain range. That others might continue searching for additional truths seemed appropriate to the nature of democracy itself, a system requiring perpetual vigilance rather than comfortable assumption. As he descended toward his temporary camp, the hiker felt neither triumph nor despair, but rather the melancholy acceptance of someone who had glimpsed complexity previously unimagined and must now incorporate that knowledge into continuing life. The mountains, in revealing their secret, had revealed something about human institutions as well, both their capacity for deception and their potential for correction when truth finally emerged. The morning air carried the distinct crispness that only September in these mountains could deliver, the same quality that had marked the day of discovery 2 years earlier. Dew clung to alpine grasses, catching the first golden rays of sunlight and transforming the sloping meadow into a sea of glittering diamonds. The hiker paused in his descent, recognizing the parallel to that earlier moment when his world still operated according to simpler principles. The symmetry felt appropriate, a circular return that acknowledged both what had changed and what remained constant. The mountains endured, their geological processes continuing across timescales that rendered human activities momentary by comparison. The truth, once revealed, also endured, documented now in congressional records, scientific analyses, institutional reforms, and historical accounts. His own journey would continue as well, altered but not defined solely by the discovery that had propelled him into unexpected territory. The wilderness skills developed across decades would serve him in new landscapes, new challenges, new explorations, though never again with the innocence that had preceded that moment when his binoculars had detected something that shouldn't have existed. "The mountains keep no secrets forever," he murmured, repeating words he had spoken to himself during that first night watching over the crash site. Neither do human institutions, however hard they try. Perhaps that represented the most important understanding gleaned from this extraordinary journey, that truth, like water following gravity's imperative down a mountain watershed, eventually finds its path despite obstacles placed in its way. Systems designed to conceal reality, however sophisticated, eventually encounter the counterforce of human conscience, human curiosity, and human courage. As the hiker completed his descent, rejoining the human world beyond the wilderness boundary, he carried that understanding as both burden and liberation. The path ahead remained partially obscured, his ultimate role in the continuing story yet to be determined. But the essential journey, from discovery through revelation to acknowledgement, had reached completion. Some mountains would keep their secrets for decades or centuries. Some truths would remain hidden behind institutional barriers, but the principle remained. What is concealed may eventually be revealed when circumstance and courage converge. That possibility, however remote in any individual case, represented hope in a world of increasingly complex systems and power dynamics. The hiker shouldered his pack one final time, adjusting the straps with the practiced motion of someone for whom wilderness had been both profession and sanctuary. The weight settled comfortably across his shoulders, the physical embodiment of responsibility carried and eventually discharged. Whatever came next, he had completed the journey that began with an accidental discovery on a remote mountain ridge. The truth had emerged. The systems had responded. The cycle of concealment and revelation had completed one full turn, leaving both wilderness and civilization transformed in ways still unfolding. The hiker turned toward the horizon, ready for whatever path might follow. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe for more investigative thrillers that explore the boundaries between wilderness and civilization, truth and deception, individual courage and institutional power. New content arrives weekly, bringing you into worlds where discovery leads to transformation and ordinary observations reveal extraordinary realities.